This is Legislative Review on Prairie Public. I'm Dave Thompson. Thanks for joining us. It is crossover, and here to talk about what the legislature has been doing is State Senator Jim Dotzenrod from Wyndmere. He's a Democrat. Senator, thank you for being here.
Well, you bet, Dave. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, you're on tax committee. You're also on public political subdivisions, but I'd just like an overall question to start.
Okay.
Where are we at crossover?
Well, I think that where we are right now is about where people probably would have guessed when we started the session. We've got the governor's budgets, the governor's numbers, and we've been working through those in the appropriations committees and making adjustments, and there are some adjustments. There have been some things we've added in spending and some things we've taken away in spending. I think that the legislature so far has tried to hold back a bit, you might say, and so I think, you know, we are very close to having the numbers work for balancing the budget based on what we started with at the beginning of the session, and not a lot of radical departure from those numbers.
Yet the March revenue forecast coming up on, I think, March 18th will probably tell a different, not a different tale necessarily, but will cement some things in.
Well, everyone is kind of holding back on passing judgment or getting too fixed on doing one thing or another a certain way based on waiting to see what these numbers say on March 18th.
Now, one thing it probably will affect is tax policy, and there were a number of bills introduced on both sides concerning reductions in income tax and corporate taxes. There was a sales tax reduction bill. There was a tax to cut tax on internet providers, and there were lots of tax breaks, but it seems like things have whittled down, haven't they?
Oh, that's right. Those things that would take revenue away, by and large, there have been a lot of those have gone down to defeat. We still have the bill that was in the governor's budget, the $100 million individual income tax cut and the 25 corporate. That's still around, but I sense that if we get into a situation where we're trying to make ends meet and we're not quite right, there's a sense, I believe, that could go by the wayside too.
I know in talking to your chairman, he's also the same feeling that be very careful, tread lightly at this point.
I think so. I think that we're concerned about the health, or at least a lot of us are, about the health of the general fund, because you know, when we had plenty of extra mineral revenue, the general fund, we weren't as dependent. We had a place we could go to if we ran short. But with oil revenues now down, the general fund is going to be important to keep it as healthy as we can. So I think you'll see people being a little bit careful about getting too carried away with the tax cuts, at least until we know more about where we're headed here.
So what do you think is going to be the focus of your committee going forward now?
Well,
I'm talking finance and tax.
Yeah, in the tax committee, I think that the priorities there are we want to have a pretty good property tax reduction bill of some kind, and the other matters that more are probably about trying to make the system work better, trying to improve the way property taxes are determined, the kind of making it transparent, easier to understand. There's quite a bit of effort in that direction as far as property tax goes. But yeah, I think you won't see a lot of very ambitious changes in the tax system this time because of sort of the sobering reality of these lower oil prices.
And since we're talking about oil prices, we might well interject that oil prices going down also affects the other tax types, sales tax and income tax.
That's
especially,
right.
If I remember correctly, it's about $140,000, $150,000 less in sales tax per rig. If rigs go,
you're pretty close on that. I don't remember the numbers exactly. I thought it was 130,000, but you're pretty close. And when the governor's numbers that we had in December were modified and adjusted in January, those values were put in there. And so we do have numbers now that reflect a judgment that was made in January about what the effect of lower oil prices could be at that time. And we were using, at that time, they used 45 to 65 over the next 2 years as a range for oil prices. And that's the most recent numbers, the ones we're working with right now.
And those are the ones from Moody's Analytics, our consultant, correct?
I think that's where they got them. You know, that was a December to January change. And I think they came from Moody's. I believe.
And of course, Moody's is going to have the major role in the forecast in March.
Well, they'll be conducting the presentation here in March, so we'll get more or less a pretty comprehensive view from them at that time.
Well, let's talk about property taxes because that's still top of mind
Yep.
among a lot of people that I've talked to. The legislature has come up with some pretty good property tax relief. Some of it coming in the form of increased education spending.
Yes.
Some of it in some guaranteed fund, to fund some things and reduce property tax, reduce mills.
Right.
But there is starting to be some concern about the sustainability of that. What's your perspective?
Well, I think it's a reasonable concern to be thinking about, can we sustain what we're doing? The legislature 2 years ago set aside some money for us to have this time and make that available. And I don't know when we get through this session if we're going to be able to do that again at the end of this session, provide money and set it aside for the following session. So I think we're going to be in good shape coming out of this session. From what I can tell at this point, we're going to have a fairly decent property tax bill to work with leaving here. But as far as getting ready for 2 years from now, we may have to make some adjustments or try to. I mean, it's unclear. It's unclear at this point how we're going to manage 2 years from now. I think we are more immediately preoccupied right now with what we're doing now. But I think looking down the road, that being able to do this again 2 years from now, I think it's a reasonable thing to be concerned about. Yeah.
What do you consider in this session to be a good property tax bill?
Well, I think if we can be, we felt leaving the session 2 years ago that we ended up with about $800 million in property tax relief. It looks like we will be over that this time. The portion of the foundation aid program that we can attribute, that we feel it makes, based on our history, that is due that we could call property tax relief, is probably going to be around $870 million. And then if we can do the 12% on top of that, which at this time is still alive, it was in the governor's budget, and there's about $250 million there. So, you're looking at about probably a little over $1.1 billion, if we can hang together with those numbers before we're done here.
Now, it's interesting. Of course, the state itself does not levy property taxes except for I guess it's one statewide mill for the UND Med School.
Yes.
So the legislature got into it just because of taxpayer demand. We've got to do something about these raising property taxes. So 2 years from now, we may be looking at a bit of a different conversation then.
Yes, that's right. We might be looking at something completely different 2 years from now. If oil should go below $40 and stay there, that's going to change. Then we get into some real rate reductions on the oil revenue. But as it stands right now, the projections we're using show us going down and then recovering some. So I think that's one of the gray areas with having this mineral money to work with, is there's a lot of volatility there.
It's commodity prices, just like farm products.
Right. That's right. It's a commodity.
And farm
price.
is not necessarily in the best of shape right now. It seems like maybe some of the indicators are it's coming back to some of the prices we've seen, but there was for a while even corn prices seem to be pretty.
Well, the commodity prices, the grain prices have come up a little bit off their lows, but the people that are going in and getting financed now, getting their money lined up to farm in the coming year, it's a pretty sobering conversation they're having with their banker, because it is very hard right now for anyone to put together a budget for wheat or corn or soybeans and come up with something that puts them in the black. So I think that we've been here before. We've seen commodity grain prices bad, and just because they're bad now doesn't mean they're going to be bad 6 months from now. But this is we are seeing worldwide grain inventories grow, and so it does look like we're going to have low grain prices for some time. So I think that if we see farmers that are going to farm this coming year and they can't make any money, that comes out that at the end that we still have these low prices, The real worry is 2016, because most people, we've had a good run here, and farmers have made some pretty good profits here over the last 5 years. It's been some good times to be farming. But if you have a bad year, the one bad year, I think most people and the lenders and everyone feel we'll be all right. But if this continues like this, that could become a real big problem for us.
And of course, affecting state revenues, affecting the state budget 2 years from now.
That's right. And, we've talked earlier about property taxes, and if the property tax system continues to, those individuals that are farmers and ranchers there, by necessity, they have to have some property to make their operations work. They've got a property tax bill that can be fairly significant, and if that comes in the fall, or at the end of the year here, and they've had a year that hasn't been good, that's the legislators are going to hear from those people when that bill comes in December, if they're in financial trouble and they get this bill that's, let's face it, over the last few years, property taxes have been going up, valuations on property have gone up. So that's another thing in the tax system that's a concern.
Let me ask you about that, because of property taxes generally, because one of the bills that is going through that I think just got a positive vote in the House, if I remember correctly, is a bill that would change the way property taxes are valued from mills to dollars, based on dollars per thousand.
Yes. And that bill, there was a bill that did that in the interim committee, and it came out of the interim committee with a pretty good vote. And I don't know how the vote went in the House. Evidently, the bill must have passed, and it's on its way over to the Senate. But I voted no in the interim committee, and it really is a way of trying to make the promoters of this would like to believe that it's a way to make the system more clear, more easy to understand. But in the end, if you're familiar with mills, valuation and mills, it doesn't really change how the numbers come out. It doesn't affect the bottom line, the tax bill at the end. Its proponents are promoting it from the standpoint that it makes the system easier to understand.
Simplicity and transparency were some of the arguments.
Those are the arguments. I myself found that it's a matter of where the decimal point is, and that's probably about it. And I didn't really know that I could see that, from my point of view, that it's not going to change the tax bill. Maybe it's something that'll have legs and will get passed. But from the standpoint of the people who are concerned about how are we going to pay our bills, it doesn't change anything.
Let me ask you this, just as an overall arching question. If you had your druthers on changing tax policy in North Dakota, what would you do?
Well, I like the idea that we have a system of taxes that's fair, and there's some balance in the way the system is set up. That is, we can only really essentially tax three things: sales, income, and property. And even some of the mineral taxes, you could argue, are a form of a type of sales tax on that revenue or that item that's severed from the ground. But for the consumers out there and the tax-paying public, generally it's sales, income, and property. So I've always taken the view, and it's been sort of conventional wisdom, that those three tax types should be in balance, somewhat in balance. And one of the merits of that, one of the arguments for that, is that each of these three, sales, income, and property, will affect a different group of taxpayers in a different way. So if you have one that's withered away or weak or ineffective or almost gone, that then will put a lot of extra weight on the two that are left. But if you can keep sales, income, and property relatively in balance, there are people that earn their living who are highly dependent on owning property and have to have property. They'll be affected more by ones. There are people that have income, significant income, but they don't really have to have much property to earn a good income. They're not affected that so much, but they can make a contribution through the income tax system. And there are people that sales and paying sales tax, there are certain times in the life of a business or the life of a family when sales taxes are fairly significant, and other times different stages of their life, they're not paying that much in sales tax. But each of these three, if we have a balanced, somewhat fair system where we don't become heavily dependent on any one of those three, and we can keep them in somewhat, not perfect balance, but relatively shouldering a reasonable share of the load, I think we'll end up with a system that's going to not single out any one group of taxpayers and for paying more than the others.
This comes the three-legged stool theory.
That's the
basically.
old proverbial wisdom was the three-legged stool. That's right. I first was on the tax committee in the 80s, and Chuck Goodman from Grand Forks was the chairman at that time, and that was his view. And I think I've heard that over the years on taxes, that it makes sense to have a system that's carries some balance in the way we tax and collect revenue from the taxpayers.
Well, refresh my memory. You were in the Senate before.
Yes,
Chuck
I
Goodman's-
served several years back, or a number of years back, and was a freshman here in '78, and then served four-year terms. And then I had some issues at home with family and the business, and I decided to leave, and I left. And then there was an opening here a few years ago, and we couldn't find a candidate. We're looking for a young, fresh face, and we couldn't find one, so I agreed to run again in '08 and come back, and I've been back here since '08.
The reason I wanted to ask that question, to put that on the record, is because you've seen this oil up and down before.
Right. We had really went through a real wide swing in the '80s, because we had Measure Number 6 passed by the voters in the election of 1980, just before the 1981 session. So when the '81 session came, we had this brand new 6.5% oil extraction tax, and it created a sense that, well, we really had a road ahead of us that was really going to be financially strong. So we proceeded to start cutting other taxes. There were sales tax cut bills and income tax cut bills, and then after a few years after that, it wasn't very long really. It didn't take long. By '83, by '85, we were seeing revenue shortfalls, and one of those sessions in there, we actually had to do an allocation, and on the second year of the biennium, provide less money to the schools than we had promised, and it created a lot of trouble for us. And part of the reason we have the Foundation Aid Stabilization Fund today was because of what happened to us there in the '80s. So I think it's a reasonable thing to take a look at what we did then and say, can we act today in such a way that we avoid that happening to us again? And try keep as I mentioned earlier, if we can keep our general fund in a healthy balance in there, and don't become so overly dependent on oil and other mineral revenues, so that if those run into some trouble, then we've got real trouble.
I don't want to say that this is a backstop, but you do have the legacy fund, which you might be able to start using to patch up some budget holes in the 2017 session.
That's true. It does become available in 2017, and the rules on that say you can only take out 15% of the principal. The legislature will automatically receive the interest on the fund starting in 2017. I do think it's going to be hard to get the legislature to get that two-thirds vote. It's going to take a two-thirds vote in both the House and Senate to be able to get at that. And I think there's going to be a lot of sentiment that we should be able to find ways to make this work without going into that. But it may happen if we get the kind of situation that's dire enough or difficult enough, and we get leaders in place that convince the legislature we need to do this. There may be some plans to try to get some of that money and use it. But I think there's going to be a big sort of intuitive sense that we're going in there too soon. We need to hold back. We need to find ways to manage on our own without using that.
So you've got a savings account there.
There's a savings.
Not draw on it now. Wait and see what happens.
I think that's going to be the starting position that most people will have in the session that follows 2 years from now, is that we should try and make do with what we've got. And there are provisions there that we can get access to it if the right conditions are there. But hopefully we'll be, if we can keep, as I've said before, the general fund, if we can avoid weakening the general fund, which was what we did in the 1980s, if we can avoid that, and I think we'll be able to manage our way through. But who knows? We're in a volatile. 68%. I think I've heard the number of our economy is commodity based, and that's a prescription for some pretty big swings. And so we'll just need to be prepared. And it is fortunate the legacy fund is there, because it is a last resort, and hopefully we will find ways not to have to use it.
I'd like to just change direction slightly.
Okay.
And what got me thinking about this is that it's not necessarily tax money, but it's how you pay state employees, which does come from tax money. And the governor wanted a 4 and 4 with 1% going into retirement. The 4% is an average raise per year of the biennium, so that's why it's 4 and 4. 1% going into retirement. The Republicans have said, let's do 3 and 3 and don't do the full 1%. I wanted to get your perspective on that. I'm sure you've been hearing from state employees.
Yes, and I mean, I think, given the fact that where we are and that there's a cautionary sense about the way we're operating now, that probably is the position we should take, with an understanding that if we do come out of this, that we should have a alternative or a backup plan that would allow us to return to what the governor had proposed.
So contingency budgeting
A
is
contingency
a good thing.
budget would make sense, it seems to me, to be prepared for that.
And not to be put too fine a point on that, it looks like the majorities have said, yeah, we're going to do that in the budgets, in the final budget. They think they're
That's
gonna
the
do that.
impression I'm getting, is that the leadership there in the House and the Senate, that they are preparing some alternative ways of bringing this to a conclusion when we get out of here at the end of April, and that they're looking at ways to do that. Also, they're talking about trying to finish in 75 days, and I hope they can make that work. That's not easy to do. That'll be difficult. But if they can save some days, they may be able to have an option of coming back for a few days and making some adjustments if they feel they need to.
Do you think that's possible?
75 to finish in 75 days.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's possible, but I think it's very difficult. Very hard to squeeze the system much more than we are. But you know, we ended this crossover with one extra day that we didn't need and we didn't use, and that'll be available now after crossover. And we have in years past been able to finish in 75 days, but the situation in the Bakken has really added a lot of workload. There's a lot of issues there with not just highways, but other things going on in the Bakken that have created bills and need for the legislature to think about some of the things that need some help in that area.
Since you brought that up, the House, of course, has voted to change the allocation formula for oil taxes
Yeah.
from 2575 to 3070, but that's not where some of the people wanted to go to 6040. And when I'm talking about 2575, it's 25% local, 75% state.
That's right.
Now it's 30% local, 70% state.
Right.
But the people in the West wanted to go to 60% local, 40% state. You got a chance at it, not necessarily into tax committee, but Senate's
Well,
going to take a look at it now.
I do think that is one of those things that will probably be how we finally come out of that will depend a lot on the forecast that we get. And I mean, I do think that the priority the legislature is going to have is trying to make sure that our numbers come out right, that we're able to leave here with a balanced budget, and that is going to influence a lot, I believe. And I think a lot of us feel we have an obligation to get more of this revenue. It's coming from the Bakken. There's tremendous needs there. I think there's a sense that we've got to find a way to make more predictable their circumstances for them and get more of a dependable share, a larger share back to them. But I think it's probably going to be one of those things that'll be held off to one of the last big decisions that'll be made.
I've been
as
thinking
we-
that too, that the Office of Management and Budget Bill is normally the last one, but I have a feeling this one is going to be second or third to last.
It's a really big thing. This is really a big issue, and especially for those people that are in that area, but for all the rest of the legislature and the state as well, because it is the way that those oil dollars, which have become a fairly big part of the way we're managing, and it's the way that those oil dollars are going to flow into the state and into the local, and we'll see how that comes out. But you can feel that there's a sense we need to do a better job, and there's a consensus, I think, that we'd like to do more, and how we come out of that at the end is going to be one of those difficult, tough decisions that'll be made at the end of the session.
I have a feeling we're going to see a very intense conference committee
That
Probably
one will
leadership,
be an
I'm
intense.
guessing.
That's a good word, Dave. It will be an intense matter with a lot on the line for those people from that area, particularly. Yep.
Since we just got a couple of moments left, I wanted to ask you about annual sessions. Were you yay or nay on annual sessions?
Well, this last session, the last bill we had, I did vote no, and my sense and the way I've always looked at that up in the past has been, if we're going to go to annual sessions, I think we have to have the voting public involved to do that. I know we have the option in the Constitution with the 80 days, and there may be I may be a little more open to doing this now than I have been in the past, because we are seeing these commodity price swings, and we can see ourselves going sort of feast to famine in a fairly short period of time. And the argument to me is as strong now as it's ever been. But I am concerned. I think the public perception of what we're doing and going to annual sessions, and we've had this idea of a citizen legislature that we only meet every 2 years. I don't know. Maybe it's becoming an antique. Maybe we can't make it work as well as we'd like to, as well as we could in the past. But at least for now, I felt if we're going to make a change like that, we're probably going to have to go to the ballot box and ask the voters for some measure of approval to do that.
And with that, we have to stop.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep, you bet. Glad to be here.
Our guest today, Senator Jim Dotzenrod from Wyndmere, North Dakota. He's a Democrat. He's on the Senate Finance and Taxation Committee. For Prairie Public and Legislative Review, I'm Dave Thompson.